the heck, Europe? You went from the classical era with running water, air conditioning, paved roads, and easily available education systems, and then during the Middle Ages, a great deal of that was lost, and Europe slipped back into ignorance and superstition. How could that happen? And how did it round off? Well, first off, we need to establish some important backstory because we are going to do an extremely abbreviated and sped up revision of history, since the period of the Middle Ages covers hundreds of years from the fall of Rome to the Renaissance. Broadly speaking, the Middle Ages extends from about 500 to 1500 CE, so that's a long time. But contrary to popular belief, technological advancement did not come to a screeching halt at that time. People were not a bunch of dummies covered in filth, and the Middle Ages actually contributed quite a lot to technological advancement. But certainly it is true that from a purely European perspective, the Middle Ages were not as notable as the classical period had been. When the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 CE, it created a major power vacuum in Europe. At that time, much of Europe was dominated by warring tribes that the Romans had lumped all together under the banner of barbarians. In reality, the barbarians were a massively diverse group of people with unique cultural identities and languages, but because the only written histories of these people come from biased Roman scholars, little is actually known about them for certain. What is known is that it was the barbarians who caused the final fall of Rome, and from the moment Rome's power was broken, its infrastructure began to erode. The majority of the people that lived in Europe at that time lived in rural villages isolated from one another. Without the unification and protection of Rome, the European tribes began to revert to their fortified lodges, which ultimately evolved into the fortresses and castles of the Middle Ages. If there's one thing that history has showed us very clearly, it's that Europeans love nothing better than to make war on other Europeans. And without the protection of the Roman Empire keeping these tribes from each other's throats, Europe fell into a very long and very brutal period of war. Invaders taking over former Roman territories didn't particularly care about things like mathematics, reading, and the sciences. They lived in a rural society, and what was real for them was what they dealt with every day: farming, fighting, feeding, and so on. Conquering and assimilating Roman settlements, the invaders took artisans, scholars, merchants, engineers, builders, and doctors as slaves, or else killed them outright. Through generations of war, plague, and famine, the old knowledge was slowly whittled away, and the people learned to do without it. Part of the problem, too, was that to reestablish the old systems for things like sewers, running water, and roads, and so on, required a lot of capital. And most people in Europe either didn't have the money or didn't feel that it was a necessary expense. Don't forget, Rome was collecting taxes and tribute from most of the known world at its height. That's how they paid for all those civic projects. But in the days of tribal fighting and the feudal system that followed, that kind of wealth simply didn't exist in most places in Europe. So it isn't so much that people forgot the lessons that they had learned in antiquity, but rather that they were making do without them. And this is where most grade school history books end. The Middle Ages was a period of farming and fighting with no major advancements. What they mostly do not teach, or if they do, they tend to gloss over, was that Western Europe didn't exist in a vacuum. See, after the Western Roman Empire fell, the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, continued on for another 1,000 years. Those technological advancements in science, math, history, astronomy, physiology, and all the rest of it were not lost, and their development did not stop. What changed is that the banner was taken up primarily by the Arabic empires of the Middle East and what used to be Persia. Situated on major trade routes from east to west, the Arabs were ideally placed to benefit from all of the combined knowledge of both Europe and Asia, and as a result, their society boomed during the Middle Ages, or as it's referred to in Muslim histories, the Golden Ages. During this time, Muslim scholars grew and expanded on classical ideas from Old Rome to a degree that can scarcely be imagined. By the middle of the Middle Ages, between 1000 and 1200 CE, Arabic cities were turning out the undisputed best doctors, architects, engineers, astronomers, and scientists in the world. Even in Catholic Europe, which was adamantly anti-Muslim, they recognized the skill of Arabic scholars and would send people to study with Muslim masters. There was really only two things holding back the Enlightenment that came with the Renaissance, and they were the speed at which information could travel back in those days of horses and wagons, and religious bias. Here again, it's a common misconception that the church was anti-science or anti-progress, and that is simply not true. In fact, the most literate, artistic, and uneducated people in Europe during the Middle Ages were members of the church. The church was extremely wealthy at that time, far more than any individual lord or even king, and they were the only ones that could afford to sponsor grand research projects and artistic endeavors. So the Catholic Church was very much encouraging education and technological advancement. Where they ran into problems, though, was they violently and wholeheartedly were anti-Muslim and anti-Jew. The Catholics viewed non-Christians as heathens, as agents of the devil trying to shake people's belief in God and his church. Because of this, there was tremendous resistance to Muslim teachings, and the knowledge spread very slowly. Ironically, it was during the Crusades, when Europeans were trying to take the Holy Land from the control of the Muslims, that most cultural exchange happened. Europe, though not placing as much emphasis on headwork as the Arabs, had not been standing still, and had been making some extremely important inventions of their own. Due to thousands of years of killing each other, the advancements in arms and armor had grown rapidly, and a focus on agriculture had led to inventions like the plow, horseshoes, windmills, and grindhouses, and many, many more. Ultimately, the combining of the teachings of West and East led to the Renaissance, the revival of the classical styles and ideology of combining the best ideas in the world into one teaching. The people of the Middle Ages were not stupid or backward. They did not stand still. They did not stagnate. If there had only been peace between the peoples of the Middle Ages, there is truly no telling how far they could have come. And that's why it's so important that we keep our eyes and mind open and always be creative. Thanks for watching.